Hello, everybody. Welcome. We'll get started here in less than a minute. All right, there's the beeper. Let's get started. Hello and welcome all. My name is Alan Barr with COEH Northern California. On behalf of the NIOSH supported education and research centers throughout the country, we're pleased to present the 2022 ERC Ergonomics webinar series, where we offer free monthly webinars on various topics on human factors and ergonomics. This collaborative effort on behalf of each ERC's continuing education program aspires to provide access to current research supported through NIOSH ERC programs. Thank you for joining us today. All participants who log in with their registration email will receive a link to the recorded webinar and an evaluation form that will qualify you for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. Upcoming webinars, September 7th, Environmental Epigenetics and Intergenerational Equity. You may register for that and other upcoming webinars at coeh.berkeley.edu/webinars. You'll be muted for today's presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the online Q&A. We'll save time at the end of the presentation to address questions. As I said, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available along with past webinars on the COEH Northern California YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe to our channel to help us continue to grow. Today's webinar is titled Simple Rules for Preventing Back Injuries at Work and Improving Productivity. Our speaker today is Dr. Robert Phalen. Dr. Phalen has over 25 years of experience as a health and safety professional and in academia. His 10 years of experience as a practicing industrial hygienist and ergonomics specialist. Later in his career, he received his doctoral degree in environmental health sciences from UCLA with a specialization in industrial hygiene. He's currently the program chair and a professor of occupational safety and health at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. Dr. Phalen is a certified industrial hygienist and a fellow of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. He now dedicates much of his time to teaching, research, and service to AIHA at the national and local levels. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Robert Phalen. Dr. Phalen.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. I'll bring my video on just for a little brief bit here before we get started. So I wanted to let you know that I exist, I'm here, and thanks for joining us. Kind of my purpose today is just to share some of my experience, working, even when I was working as an industrial hygienist, a lot of it involved ergonomics because one of the companies I worked with, we were primarily involved in loss control. And that would be case management, and then also on the health and safety side, helping prevent those costly injuries and illnesses, and quite often the major issues were ergonomic issues that really would make a difference, and then also back injuries was one of the more prominent ones. So I wanted to just share some experience and maybe a little bit on some research we've done related to that, but not much, just from a time standpoint. But thank you for joining me, and we'll get started here. So a little bit, on the background on back injuries. Some of the more recent data, shows that when we look at musculoskeletal disorders, back-related injuries in the workplace account for almost 39% of those MSDs, and they typically involve more lost work days than other musculoskeletal disorders. Quite often, the average worker misses about 6 days on average, but the median is around 8 or 9 days. Looking at many of these reported injuries. with a significant number missing more than 31 days, about 20% of them. If you're talking about something like a herniated disc, I've seen those at around 90 days. So from a loss prevention and control standpoint before, with managing cases with injured workers, we pretty much knew that if someone had a back injury, we really had to be proactive with, getting them rehab, getting them proper treatment, and, getting them back into some form of work, some type of modified duty. And it was almost like every day that they were off work was just that more likely that they may never come back and they may be permanently disabled and never be able to do that job again. So on the case management side, it's not as proactive. So on the health and safety side, we can be a little bit more proactive. We can go out to those companies, those organizations, and really make a difference. So even when I was working as an industrial hygienist, I would say sometimes half of my time was just dealing with ergonomic issues, and because we knew that it was going to have a huge impact on the company and their productivity. Most of you probably know that injured workers are not very productive. There can be huge costs from the medical standpoint, the workers' compensation standpoint, and all those other hidden kind of costs of an illness or an injury. And this has a huge impact on just our economy in general, not to mention the impact it has on the injured worker, that their livelihood is important and just as important. I don't want to spend a lot of time on statistics, but I just want to, point out this is some of the more recent data looking at work-related MSDs with days away from work based on some selected occupations, and then also looking at the parts of the body. If you look at the kind of yellowish gold bars there, that's back disorders. And so you see that it's predominantly the back. And then if you look at the top one, all occupations, if we look at that as the average, we can see that nursing assistants, obviously they're lifting patients more likely than not. And then store clerks and order fillers, maintenance repair workers and laborers that are also doing material handling, they're all above that average. And that's pretty consistent with my experience as well with back injuries. So what are the barriers, some of those barriers to progress that at least I've noticed and had to deal with when I was practicing in the field? And one of the ones that I thought was definitely was an issue is that basic rule, lift with your legs. And so you see the picture, there's the perfect scenario of someone doing a power lift where they're squatting, they're straddling the load, and they're getting as close as they can, and they're lifting with their legs, keeping their back straight. And, that works for a scenario where you have this perfect size box, so we've got this box here and it's a good size box, but that's not all boxes are that size. And that was one of the problems I ran into, at least when looking at these types of situations. If it's a bigger box or an awkward shaped box or load that they're lifting, the knees can get in the way and it can be hard to straddle that load. And that was the other issues, straddle load. Sometimes it's difficult. And in those cases, it can push the knees, if they get in the way, it can push that lumbar back farther. And, that torque on the lower lumbar is going to increase the farther away that load is from the lumbar. And so that's one of the issues that I typically ran into. The other thing that I find to be an issue is, this type of lifting is like a power lift. And if you were to go to the gym and say, I go to a personal trainer, I want to get a personal trainer, I want to, get in shape, the first thing they're going to have you do probably is some types of power squats. They're going to have you do squats. They're going to work those major leg muscles. You're going to get worn out. And so can we expect workers to be doing the same thing continually? Like that takes a lot of energy. Someone's going to get easily fatigued. And I think instinctively, when I see workers working, they don't do these types of activities because of the amount of energy expenditure, and that you're really mainly focusing on some major muscle groups. They're going to get fatigued. It's much easier just to stoop over and grab it. You're using more muscles maybe. But I see that as an issue, is that instinctively, it's difficult to get workers to do these types of like power squat type lifts continually. I also saw some issues with the assessment tools that were available. We have the NIOSH Revised Lifting Equation. Definitely, they're very useful. But I saw there's some limitations that they have, and I'll kind of discuss those in a little bit. We have the ACGIH and their TLVs with some simple rules and some tables that we can use to kind of assess whether or not there's a risk related with that lifting, and see if there's some solutions that we could implement. And then we have the HAT biomechanics models that I've used in the past too, and those can be very useful to give a general idea. Like as a general rule, if I'm looking at lower back issues, a lot of times I'm looking to see if that force of torque is going to be greater than 200 nanometers. There's indications in the literature that, once you get above that, we see greater association with low back pain type of issues. Obviously, if you're getting above 1,000 nanometers, the tissues, that's kind of the limit of them. You could see some more permanent type injuries. But they're all very useful, but with some potential limitations. Here's an example of, those general rules. So there's some pictures here coming from, some group showing how to properly lift a box that's on the ground. And I've just shown like what some of those moment arms are related to the weight of the object in the lower lumbar. And you can see that, the lower it is to the ground, the higher it gets. If we're talking about the NIOSH recommended weight limit and their tool, the lower it is to the ground, that horizontal multiplier is increasing, and that's increasing the risk. So by the time this person has it up to waist height, it's going to be much improved, but it's still an awkward load. And you can kind of see that when lifting from the ground, he's twisting his body. It's in probably the worst possible time when that force of torque on the lower lumbar is going to be at its greatest. And then the other thing, for a scenario like this, even though the NIOSH recommended weight limit for this would be 0 to 12 pounds, so obviously would indicate this would be a hazardous type lift if it was, any appreciable weight. I ran the HAT biomechanical model, and in the first part where it's on the ground, about 75% of the torque on the lower lumbar is going to be attributed to the body, the leaning forward. So it's the body and the object, and that's the key thing, that the biomechanical model kind of helps us assess the upper body, whereas the NIOSH lifting equation has some limitations there. So here's an example of the NIOSH lifting equation, and this comes from the manuals, a common picture that many of us look at. And, I look at this and I see somebody lifting a large kind of fairly awkward type object, and it's going to be lifting it at a 63 inches vertical distance. And the thing I want to point out is look at his knees. And we look at the knees are in the way, so he can't straddle the load. And this is one of the limitations I see kind of with the NIOSH lifting equation. We just have to be aware of, so we can take that to account. So one issue is the knees can get in the way, and that's pushing that lower lumbar out back farther away. It's increasing the load of the upper body and that force of torque on the lower lumbar. And so this is, some additional issues that or concerns from an ergonomic standpoint from the lifting scenario. The other point I want to make is, for someone to lift something 44 pounds like that, and I've lifted drums up about that height before. There's one thing that you need in order to get these up from these types of stances, and that's acceleration. You really have to put some additional force in there. And that's one of the limitations that I just wanted to point out is none of these models really take into account the force of acceleration. We've done some research looking at what that potential additional force or even torque on the lower lumbar could be due to acceleration, found that in many cases it was around 25% additional force. And we were using like force plates and evaluating it that way. So it's another consideration, another potential limitation if we're using some of these tools. So here's an example of the kind of the head and torso biomechanical model. And the middle one you can see here, if we look in the middle, that if someone is bending with their knees, kind of keeping their back straight, that definitely that moment, that torque on the lower lumbar is the lowest. So that's improved. And this makes a good justification of bend with your knees, keep your back straight and lift, that it's going to decrease that kind of that torque on the lower lumbar. The only thing I want to point out is look at where the weight is in relation to the knees. It's between the legs. And that's important. We have a small object they're lifting. It pretty much has to be between the knees in order to properly do this. And so that's where that simple rule comes into play. I'm not seeing boxes that are always the size of a kettlebell. We're not seeing patients that are the size of these types of objects. And we have to take into account the knees. And so a lot of this is going to come down to, as a simple rule, is any kind of lifting that is below knee level, the knees are potentially going to get in the way. So what are some factors associated with back injuries? We have to, most of us will probably understand the weight and position of the object. How far away it is from our body is important. But we also have to be concerned about the weight and position of the upper body. And so the biomechanical models help us take those into account. And so that gives us a little better idea. But that's an important one, and that's why I put it in blue. Twisting motions, obviously going to put uneven forces on our lower lumbar, can have issues on with our spinal disc. Acceleration, I've thrown in there. Probably should put a question mark on that one. Don't really know, there's been some related research, but there's still some question marks on what are these potential effects of acceleration with some of these materials handling type of jobs. And then obviously the frequency and duration of those activities are all kind of risk factors associated with back injuries. So this is just showing kind of from the standpoint of, it being close to the body versus far away. On the left, we see that, the person, if they're holding a 20-pound load, that would have to be obviously fairly small near the body, and they're standing erect, that it's going to have a minimal effort on the kind of the lower lumbar there, 80 pounds of effort. But it increases by 5 times if that load, maybe it's extended out because it's a little bit larger, going from 8 inches away from that fulcrum, meaning the lumbar, to 20 inches. So it can greatly increase that effort on the lower lumbar. And so about 5 times. Other thing I want to point out here is in the biomechanical models, it's going to take right around the chest level, the upper body weight, and also look at what that effect would be on the lower lumbar. And if I was to run for this scenario, the biomechanical model, the upper body weight would account for about 60% of the torque on the lumbar. And so that's pretty significant. And the person is only just slightly bending. And that's one reason why we see a lot of low back type pain and chronic low back issues with those that are like dishwashers. And they're just bending over slightly, but it's the weight of their body that's creating a lot of those issues. We need to definitely talk about the spine a little bit. And the lumbar is probably the more sensitive one when it comes to back injuries. I just want to point out that, in the spinal disc, we have this nucleus in the center, and it acts like a shock absorber. It's helping distribute forces in every direction. And if we keep and maintain our spine in that neutral type posture, with that double S curve, and we're doing lifting and without kind of arching the back or awkward type non-neutral postures, we can get a lot of uneven wear on the disc, especially on the outer edges of it, which can create these things like herniations that could lead to even ruptured discs. And so quite simply, if we maintain the natural curve of our back and we have even distribution of force on that spinal disc, that's the yellow thing here, that nucleus, it's almost like a jelly type center, is going to be able to distribute those forces in all directions effectively and reduce a lot of that impact of just everyday activities. However, if we're bending over, stooping over, twisting, we're not maintaining that natural curvature, then we can be putting uneven forces, even uneven wear on that spinal disc, which can push that nucleus out, even just wear away at the outer parts of the disc, the fibrous parts. And, that could be leading to something like a herniation. So I did some research early on, this is some time ago, and looked at what were the high-risk activities for the spine. And quite interesting, I found that, heavy lifting is a no-brainer. Heavy lifting has a strong association with injuries to the spine. Same thing with bending and leaning. The interesting one is lifting from the floor. So there were many studies out there looked at it and showed that just lifting from the floor was a high-risk activity. It didn't matter what the weight someone was lifting. And the reason is because we're lifting our upper body. And like I said before, in that one scenario that we looked at, if we're looking at forces of torque on the lower lumbar, that moment, 60% of it's the upper body, the person, holding that weight out. But if they're leaning forward, it can put a significant amount of torque on the lower lumbar, and that is largely related to this issue of we're seeing injuries associated with just any lifting from the floor, and so from a simple approach standpoint, how can we reduce lifting from the floor? That's a simple approach I've applied, and it seemed to have worked pretty well. And you see some of the other ones, above shoulder lifting, twisting the torso, pulling type of actions. And so these are all things that we would need to evaluate if we're trying to reduce back injuries. So these are some simple rules I've come up with for preventing back injuries. And I'll go into more detail on these as we go. But obviously, number one, eliminating unnecessary or repetitive lifting is going to be the best one. And it takes some innovation, some thought, but generally it just takes asking, why are we lifting this? Well, because it was put there, and we have to lift it. So if we can say, hey, why are we putting it there? You can come up with these solutions pretty easy, and try to eliminate those unnecessary types of activities. Avoid placing items on the floor. I think, if anything, this is the one I've had the most success with, really the most success with avoid placing items on the floor. And that goes back to the fact that a major risk factor for back injuries, and a major issue and risk factor is any kind of lifting from the floor. And some of that's going to come back to, the size of the object, the knees getting in the way, and all those other issues I'd mentioned. If we can improve that and making sure that we're lifting things and handling things near waist height, it's going to greatly improve. It's going to improve as far as the NIOSH Lifting Equation, the biomechanical model. We can see those improvements with those types of tools. Keeping the origin destination heights the same. So this helps us avoid kind of a twisting. So when the heights are different, it's more likely you will see people twisting and bending, and it's going to be a little bit more evident in some of the slides that I show you. I found some good success with using four-wheeled carts and elevated platforms instead of dollies. And the main reason there is if you're using two-wheeled dollies, most likely it means things are on the floor. And they eventually got to get picked up. So it's easy to move things from the floor to the floor with a dolly. However, eventually they got to get picked up. And so I found that using four-wheeled carts, especially with big tires that put the objects up at a higher level, really does work well. And I would say if you can get carts that have a platform at least 12 inches, usually it's better if it's a little bit higher, or just use carts that have a close to a 30-inch platform. You greatly reduce any kind of need to lift to and from the ground. Pallets work really well to elevate heavy loads. Scissor lifts are always going to be more effective and reliable, but those are an easy type of fix in many cases. And then, if you must lift, then, there's some things that we need to at least look at, and I'll come to those in a bit. So number one, eliminate unnecessary repetitive lifting. So we see an example here of a lot of effort in these pictures showing how to properly lift this object from the ground. And, we start asking some questions like, why are we lifting this? Who put this on the ground is what I'd be asking, because if I had to pick it up, I'd say, who put this on the ground? And so that type of thinking needs to go into, eliminating these types of unnecessary lifting activities. And I'll give you an example of how this can get pretty repetitive. So here's one, just from a concept of how can we eliminate, having to lift these water bottles, getting the water bottles and changing them out every few days. And you're paying about $30 per month for bottle service, maybe more now, versus point of use, maybe at $300, and just requires some general maintenance every year. That it's going to pay for itself and reduce some of those risky activities. So avoid placing items on the floor. I mean, this is the big one and I'm giving some examples like the one in the top right here. So these are things that were delivered to the end of the dock and it's delivered to the floor. And so obviously you could see the type of lifting activity that he's performing there. He's not necessarily bending with his knees and keeping his back straight. He's stooping over. Whereas at the bottom, you see this is, how we should do it properly. And so, like I said before, I think most times I don't see, even if you train people, wanting to do it properly. So, but if we didn't place the object on the floor in the first place, we wouldn't have to pick it up. It's as simple as that. And so if you put it on the floor, you're lifting it to the floor, and then you got to pick it up. So you're doubling the risk, and that's considered a high risk activity. Any lifting from the floor, doesn't matter the weight. Here's an example of this bookstore. And so they received the items at the dock. So you can see here, they received it. He took them over to the area where they were just going to check them in. So they got a computer over here. So, step 2 was he moved them from the floor to the floor. Step 3 was they put them on a cart, and they took them to the computer department. They're just small little items. In all these cases, they were basically lifted to the front, from the floor to either the cart, and from that low cart to where they were being delivered to the computer department. And then the empty boxes were put back on the low cart. And here I was just in this picture showing that the boxes on this cart, since they were empty, they kept falling off. And so they actually, there was some additional picking up of boxes from the floor. And this is pretty typical. I've seen this with use of these types of carts. And then they were taking from the low cart to recycle bin. So they've effectively lifted these things to and from the ground at least 6 times. And so the question is, could that have been eliminated? Is it possible to not have them go on the ground? And you can see every time that they're handling these things, they are just stooping over, and that's pretty instinctively. And they've had back safety training every year. In fact, we were out there doing back safety training around this time. So another solution is receive, process, and handle items near waist height. So this is going to make sure that the object is closer to the body. It's more in that safe zone for lifting. You see some examples of use of tables or risers, and even a scissor lift in one of the pictures, to keep these things more within a manageable height, so someone can actually stand up straight and the object can be close to their body. So we're going to reduce those forces on the back. Here's a receiving dock, and just going back to that, they were getting large shipments of heavy boxes. A lot of them were books. It's a bookstore, and heavy boxes of clothing. And you see instinctively that they all put their back belts on, but you can see the activities here. So you can kind of get an idea. They're all stooped over when they're lifting. And they've got the dollies there. They're moving things on dollies, putting them on dollies. And these types of lifting activities, there's some bending along with twisting here. So everything was done on the floor. And so the question is, from those types of activities with their dollies and carts, could it be done better? And yeah, definitely if it was, if they had staging tables, they actually had a retractable 30-inch setup so that they could have the boxes with rollers on it. And so, but, having everything in an appropriate height, they could avoid all that lifting from the ground. And I found that to be pretty effective. So just using 30-inch tables or shelves and 30-inch carts, and rather than those dollies and those low carts. Keeping the origin destination heights at the same, and preferably closer to around 30 inches is going to be optimal. You can see in the picture on the left, it's just a slight distance, but you can see the person is twisting their body to put it on the lower level. And then in the one in the middle, twisting his body to put it into to go up in level. And examples here, holding it from waist height and putting it on the ground. Quite often you'll see these twisting type of motions. And this was another one where there's not enough space. There was a lot of twisting activity when they were taking boxes and putting it onto these pallets. And So if we can keep those levels even, it's going to eliminate a lot of that unnecessary twisting motions. The four-wheel carts. So here's the one that I was mentioning that I found a particular success with bigger wheels and elevating it. So you're trying to get the weight above knee level, higher up, so that the knees don't become an issue. So someone doesn't have to bend down, do those power lifts. This is a good example, one that has handles, and it's on an elevated type cart. So the lifting activities are going to be, at a height where the knees aren't going to be an issue. Saving use extra pallets, same kind of concept, so instead of having pallets delivered and low-lying areas, either use a scissor lift or save some of those extra pallets and put them at an appropriate height. About 3 pallets can raise those items to above 18 inches. You have to be careful if it's a pallet has stuff stacked high, you may only need 1 or 2 pallets underneath. But the idea is to put it in that kind of what we call the safe zone for lifting, above knee height, below shoulder height. And we're going to reduce that need for any kind of bending when lifting. And then if we must, do the lift, then at least try to minimize that horizontal distance of the hands from the lower back, that distance. And then also minimize the horizontal distance of the chest. We got to be thinking about our upper body and the amount of torque it's going to be putting on the lower lumbar if we're bending and leaning forward. I've added some solutions here, that if we must do lifting from the ground, one of the things that it's a little problematic, but it can work. One of the issues I've dealt with is going in and doing, back safety training and talking to workers and trying to come up with solutions and looking at people with knee braces on, and they say, I can't do those types of lift. I cannot, so a wider stance can help reduce some of that, can help someone get a little bit lower to the ground. It seems a little awkward. So if you look at the picture up here at the right, someone doing a wide stance seems a little strange, but it's going to put less force on the joints, and it's going to, maintain your back a little bit closer, using some kind of handles, making sure that boxes have handles or making handles in there so you're not lifting at the bottom of the box. And there's definitely some solutions out there in the market. And then the one I want to just highlight is using the revised NIOSH Lifting Equation for some guidance on how we can improve some of those lifting activities. So if we look at the NIOSH Revised Lifting Equation, there's a recommended weight limit. It starts at 51 pounds. And then it has all these multipliers. So there's 6 multipliers. There's a horizontal multiplier, how far away it is from the center line between the ankles. There's a vertical multiplier for where it is in relation vertically at the start or at the end of a lift. There's a distance multiplier on how far it has to travel during that lift. There's an asymmetry multiplier, which has to do with the twisting. There's a frequency multiplier that has to do with the, it's taking into account the frequency of lifts and also the duration. And then there's a coupling multiplier, the CM, which is allowing us to, evaluate the handles, the coupling, and whether or not that has some impact. Very useful. So the NIOSH Revised Lifting Equation is taking a lot of those risk factors for back-related musculoskeletal disorders into account. Not necessarily the acceleration, and it may not always take into account, the weight of the upper body in some of these scenarios, depending on how someone's doing the lift, but it does a pretty good job. And if we really did apply this, most of those issues like the upper body weight and those forces on the back would probably be addressed. So kind of the approach that this is based on, kind of using this is, if we start with 51 pounds and we can look at these multipliers, can come up with some general rule based on, let's say all the multipliers were 0.5. Well, 51 times 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5 is obviously that recommended weight limit is going to be greatly reduced. And so what I've done, and let me go to this slide. So what I've done is just taken those multipliers and said, okay, what about if the object weighs up to 25 pounds? What would all those multipliers need to be, and in order to kind of be in a level where you could safely lift 25 pounds based on the NIOSH recommended weight limit. So if all the multipliers were at 0.89 or better, then 51 times 0.89 to the 6th power, there's 6 multipliers, would be around 25 pounds. So that's the logic there. So we were able to keep those multipliers high at 0.89 or above, then we could lift without probably much additional risk up to 25 pounds. Up to 15 pounds, those multipliers would need to be above 0.81 as a general. Up to 5, 0.68. And then, definitely there's going to be some issues if we get in this realm of getting below multipliers below 6.68. So, and I'll kind of show you how this breaks down. So just broken it down to colors, so green, orange, yellow, and red. So you can kind of see that there's the green are kind of the areas that would be, it's close to the body from a horizontal standpoint. From the vertical multiplier, it's 15 inches or above. So we're talking about around knee height and below shoulder height. So that's obviously an acceptable region. The distance multiplier, there's not traveling too far. So it's not going to be going, traveling more than about 25 inches. So we're not, if we're doing large travel of distance, that means we're either, moving it above our head or, to the ground. And so this just some general rules that I've found to be useful. And as far as the asymmetric multiplier, best case scenario is reducing it to 30 degrees or less. For frequency of lifts, reducing that, the duration and the frequency to acceptable levels. And so it's kind of all based, the color scheme is based on the green is, up to 25 pounds. The gold is, those 15 and goes down from there. And the red's going to be in a zone where it likely is going to be no recommended weight limit, that you shouldn't really be doing those activities. And then the coupling is, you see it doesn't really drop much from a multiplier standpoint. So there's very little effect of the coupling, but it is important. So I'll give you an example. This is coming from the NIOSH Lifting Equation book. And you see the person here that is lifting 40 pounds and it's traveling, that we see a vertical height here, lifting up to 36 inches. It's 15 inches off the ground to start. It shows there's some twisting there during the activities. But if we apply the simple approach of say, well, 40 pounds, what would all the multipliers need to be in order to get to 40 pounds with 51? And I determined to be 0.96. So we have 6 multipliers, 0.96 to the 6th would times 51 would get us 40 pounds. And if all of them had to be 0.96 or greater, that means the horizontal multiplier needs to be 10 inches or less. The vertical multiplier needs to be between 25 and 35. So I don't think we're or maybe not that at one part. The distance multiplier needs to be 10 inches or less. The twisting needs to be less than 15 degrees. And the frequency multiplier needs to be, no more than 0.5 lifts per minute for less than a 1 hour duration, basically. So pretty extreme type of scenario if we're really talking about 40 pounds. If we were to reduce it to 25 pounds, and so this is the worksheet for that job, we see here that the 25 pounds, the ones that would be in the red on those tables would be the horizontal multiplier. We see it's definitely not at that 0.89 or above, and the asymmetry. And so it's a general rule, the vertical component, the distance component, the frequency, and the coupling are all kind of acceptable. So using this approach, we can kind of say, well, how can we address the horizontal? Obviously, we're addressing it by going to a 25-pound bag, hopefully, but we still need to address the horizontal component and the twisting component. And most likely, if we're elevating the load up off the ground, it's going to take care of the horizontal, and so that would be probably the easiest fix, and it's going to reduce even some of the twisting. So that's what I had. Hopefully I did okay on time here.
Yeah, you did great on time. Thank you very much. Would you like to take some questions?
Sure, yeah, happy to.
Well, you showed in one of the slides an assistive device, looked like a spiked gripper coupling to cardboard boxes, from the hand to cardboard box. And a couple of people are wondering if that is commercially available.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've done some of this type of work. I mean, I've had colleagues that have talked about use of these, so that there's some out there with this, and I've seen some, held some. I haven't spent a lot of time with them, but so I guess from the standpoint, I probably haven't kept up on all the new technologies. So it's a good question, but my recommendation.
I remember seeing some of these in the lab on shelves that had been looked at before I got here. So I know they've been around for 20 odd years in one form or another. The lower version has a spiked handle. I did some looking when the question was posed, and I'm on a Google search, and I'm having trouble finding anything like that available. So I don't know if it ever took off.
Yeah, that's always the issue. Now, when I was doing a lot of ergonomics work, we had companies that we would work with, and some of these things they would even make for us, like risers for the mouse, and then sometimes you would see them on the market. But I've seen them too, but I haven't seen them in any widespread use. So it's a good question. Yeah.
I'm not going to follow the link right now, but somebody posted the LiftMate lift gripper on it's an Amazon link, but it's in a .sg, which I don't know if that's Singapore. Anyway, check out LiftMate lift gripper in your Googles and see what you come up with if you'd like to pursue that further. Thank you for that. Let's see. Is there any daily limit or rule of thumb on how long we can perform lifting tasks at a given time, or a given stretch, if you will?
I mean, I think the NIOSH lifting equation will give you some good ideas on frequency and duration. If you're asking, that's usually the typical one that most would turn to.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And someone's asking about our current understanding of back braces. What are your thoughts on back braces? You showed a lot in your imagery on the dock there.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, a back brace, in theory, I don't know if there's much new, but in theory, they can help with lifting, so if you're using them properly. The problem is I don't know if I've really ever seen anyone use it properly unless they are in a gym lifting weights, then typically I'll see them using it properly. They're using it to increase, that pressure and help stabilize the spine for their lifting. But you'll still see back injuries in weightlifters if they're not doing proper form. But that's the critical thing, for weightlifters and for workers that are essentially like athletes with having to do these repetitive lifting activities. Is the form is really critical, and so biggest issue probably is just false sense of security. You just throw on a back belt that it's going to protect you. No, it can assist in that lift if it was really critical, but there's a lot that we should be doing to reduce that need for a back belt. And I think there's a lot we can do there.
To that end, what are your thoughts on back exoskeletons?
I mean, I don't know what my thoughts are on those. I mean,
okay.
It sounds like a cool technology. I just don't know enough about the limitations when I see them. I mean, it seems like it would be useful. I mean, my approach has always been to try to reduce that need if possible. And so I think those solutions there first, but I don't have an opinion at this point.
Got you. One of the learners has posted a link to the CDC. I'm not going to share the link, or follow the link rather. But my bet is that that's going to a NIOSH doc that's saying don't use back braces or don't rely heavily on back braces. It's been a while since I've looked at that, but I imagine that's what.
Yeah, the original study with like Home Depot did. I mean, the critical flaw was they were providing back belts, but they're also providing extensive training on how to do lifting, and they've had a pretty strong program. So the question was always, was it the back belts or was all the training? And the fact, if you went to a Home Depot, you saw that they had all these forklifts and they had all these lift devices, and so they had a very strong program. So the back belts was kind of a component to a lot of other things that we couldn't tell if there was confounding there in that study. But I mean, I would agree.
Go ahead, sorry.
So the one thing I wanted to just make a point before we go here is that simple approach of just keeping stuff off the ground. It works, and I can give you a couple examples. I had one where back injuries it wasn't a big division, but back injuries were costing close to $250,000 a year. They were doing lifting to and from the ground. They had some restrictions on what could be done because it was kind of like a clean type of area that had to maintain certain things. But my only recommendation was to have to build 16-inch platforms so that those items would be put on a platform elevated, so it would reduce any kind of lifting to or from the ground. Within the next year, there was no back injuries. So we were seeing about 8 back injuries, I think eight or so. It went down to 0 back injuries after that. So, and that's just one example. There's many other examples where, I've seen huge reductions on just that simple principle of don't put it on the ground in the first place, and you don't have to lift it.
Yeah. I saw a two-wheeled, that you were talking about 4-wheeled platforms versus the hand truck or the classic two-wheel dolly. And I saw that there's a device out there, and it's rather expensive, so it could be cost prohibitive, but there's a device out there that looks like a hand truck, but the platform is motorized, or in some cases manual winched, and you can raise the platform. Once you've sort of engaged the box from the ground, you can engage this platform to rise up to your working surface to place it on something. I thought that was a nice workaround, but again, it looks really expensive, and a lot of people just won't opt for that.
Yeah, you can find some of those with more like machining companies that sell stuff for machining, because they have the need for, the carts are usually pretty heavy, but sometimes you can, the cost is a little lower through some of those suppliers that for kind of industrial type applications. I may have even seen some like with it through Granger or some of those where the cost is, but yeah, typically they are more expensive.
To the learner who asked the original question about the spine, about the back belts, another learner has directed you to Ohio State's spine research website for further reading if you would like to know more. Okay, let's see. Do you use the variable lifting equation of NIOSH? This is a learner question.
Do I use the variable one?
Yes.
No, I haven't. I haven't done a lot of the NIOSH lifting equation for some time, so I haven't. I mean, just it's probably been 15 plus years. So.
Got you. Well, the rest is more commentary than a question for you. If you have nothing further, I think we will move to end our webinar. Do you have anything you'd like to add in closing?
No, I don't think I have anything last to add.
Okay.
Or anything else.
Right, well, fantastic. Thank you very much. To the learners, you may learn more and register for our upcoming events at coeh.berkeley.edu. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find recordings of previous webinars and other events. As a reminder, all participants who logged in with their registration email will receive a link to the evaluation form that will qualify you for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. If you have any questions for us here at COEH Northern California, you can drop us a line at coehce@berkeley.edu, and we'll get back to you. That's coehce@berkeley.edu. Thank you very much to our presenter today. We really appreciate you taking the time for us. See you all next time. Bye now.
Bye, everyone.